Hi, this is Randy Wykoff, the Dean of the College of Public Health at East Tennessee State University, and I'm pleased to provide the Public Health Weekly Update with data accurate through September 22nd, 2022. This week, I'm going to address an important issue, and that is, what should I know about the global food crisis? Now, many of you may ask about that because it really hasn't been in the news much. But my assumption is it will be a major news item in the next couple of weeks or months. So let's talk about it now before it becomes a major issue. Yesterday, the World Food Program and the Food and Agriculture Organization issued a report on hunger hotspots that said, in part, an all-time high of 970,000 people, almost 1 million people, are facing catastrophic levels of hunger. Now, you say, well, there's always been famines, and there's always going to be people facing hunger. But what's worrisome about this is that it's 10 times more than 5 years ago. The other thing that's worrisome about this is that this isn't an isolated famine. Normally, we think of a famine occurring in one small area. But if you look at the hunger warning hotspots, you can see that they're all over the world, largely in sub-Saharan Africa, the Horn of Africa, but in many, many countries around the world, there is a threat of looming catastrophe, with almost 1 million people being at risk of dying from starvation in the short term. Now, people will talk about 3 causes to the global food crisis, the 3 C's: climate, conflict, and COVID. I'm going to add 2 more C's, consumption and cost, but you'll see how they all tie together. In terms of climate, this is nothing new. We've talked about the climate before, how the world's climate and temperature is rising, how this affects everywhere in the world, and how there are multiple ways in which climate change impacts food production, food availability, food transfer, food costs, and so on. So we won't go into any detail today. Conflict, we're all aware of the conflicts going on in Ukraine. But, it's helpful sometimes to look at the numbers, because then you can understand a little bit better why a conflict is impacting food production. So in the first 6 months of the invasion of Ukraine, it's estimated that 5,600 Ukrainian civilians died, about 9,000 Ukrainian military, as many as 25,000 Russian military, but perhaps more importantly, almost 7 million refugees. Well, you think of losing all those young men and women and losing that many refugees, food production simply isn't going to take place on the normal scale. Before the invasion, Russia and Ukraine accounted for almost 1/3 of the globally traded wheat and 1/5 of the globally traded maize. And it's been estimated that in Ukraine alone, it's down about 41%. If you look overall at the world this year versus last year, it's estimated that wheat production will be down about 7%. Now, unfortunately, there are conflicts not just in Ukraine, but in many, many parts of the world. And the World Food Program reports that 60% of the world's hungry live in areas affected by war or violence. So obviously, any food production there, even if it's not traded on the global scale, is going to have a negative impact. And somewhat ironically, those areas impacted by food shortage will likely see civil unrest, riots, demands for change, and so on. You think about it, if you lived in an area where suddenly you didn't have food, you would do whatever you could to assure that you had it. In terms of COVID-19, we've been reporting on this for a couple of years, over 6.5 million deaths, perhaps as many as 20 million, still 1,500 deaths a day, even though the spikes that we've seen before aren't there. But think of the reduced productivity, 6.5 million people, and then all this money has to be invested in healthcare and so on. It's a major disruption of food production. The 2 C's that I want to add are consumption and cost. And consumption has 2 meanings. One is the growth of the world's population. So we're very, very close to 8 billion people. I like to say that since my grandfather was born, the world's population has quadrupled, gone up 4 times. Since my father was born, the world's population has tripled. Since I was born, the world's population has doubled. Now, that's not to say there isn't enough food to feed everybody, but it becomes increasingly difficult to get food to everybody when there are that many people. The second aspect of consumption that's important is what we're consuming. And increasingly, we're consuming meat-based products. And there are some challenges with that. Obviously, land use and water use. This is not the day or time to discuss it. And I'm certainly not calling for the elimination of meat consumption, but definitely the reduction. Because the more of our resources that are invested in meat, that is less that can be invested in feeding grain to people. And then perhaps the most important issue right now is cost. According to the United Nations FAO, food prices were 13% higher than they were a year ago. This is something called the Food Index. They put this together. It's balancing a whole variety of factors to basically say, what does a basket of food cost somewhere in the world? And what you can see from most of the 90s and into the early 2000s, it was level. And then it started to go up and down pretty significantly. But even with the recent decrease in the last couple of weeks, it's still higher than it has ever been in history. In other words, food is less affordable to people everywhere. Cost, of course, and the UN does say that the food crisis now is about affordability, not availability. It's simply, people simply can't afford food. And it's not just food, it's also fuel costs and fertilizer costs. We're all well aware of what's happened with the cost of fuel. You may be less aware of what's happening with the cost of fertilizer. So all of this is happening. We've got 1 million people on the verge of starvation. We've got conflicts around the world. We've got climate change. And it's not unreasonable to ask, why does it matter to me? Well, there's a variety of reasons, not the least of which is 1 million deaths from starvation. I was tempted to put a picture here of starving kids that everyone always does, but instead I put up my family picture because to remind us all that this is about everyone. A family here is no different than a family anywhere else. So yes, 1 million deaths from starvation is almost inconceivable and certainly unacceptable. And then even if you don't care about that, the disruption of food production is going to impact us here for a variety of reasons. One is, for example, the price of coffee keeps going up. But also, if someone lives in a country where their economy has shifted to producing something for international trade, say coffee, say pineapples, whatever it is, and all of a sudden, the economics are such that they can't afford to ship it to market because of fuel costs. They can't afford to travel, to ship it back to the States. They're going to switch from producing that product back to a sustainable agriculture because they need to eat and live. So disruptions in food supply anywhere affect people everywhere. And then, as we know, local problems result in global impact. This has been true, at least, all of us know about the Irish potato famine and the fact that drove people from Ireland to the United States. The same thing is happening today. People will leave areas where they can't get enough to eat and go to areas where they think they can. And that causes mass migration. It causes all sorts of issues. And if you add that to the changing climate where people can't grow food for themselves, or they're losing coastal land, they can't fish the way they used to, it's going to result in people moving. And there are at least some people now who are talking about a major collapse in the food system. If prices get too high, if productivity gets too low, that may or may not happen, but it's something worth paying attention to. So think about the global food crisis as being the interrelationship of the 3 C's: COVID, conflict, and climate change, and the fact that these are irreparably interrelated. And between the 3 of them, they result in social disruption, increased prices, reduced production, and ultimately a threat to the global change, a global availability of food. So what do you need to know about the global food crisis? Probably the single most important thing is to understand that it is global. Wherever this is happening, We are not talking now about local famines. We're talking about a major disruption in food availability at this point for 1 million or more people, but in the future, potentially for more people, including us. So it's certainly something worth paying attention to. A great deal more information about public health issues on the College of Public Health website. Please share these videos with anyone who might be interested. And if they would like to be added to the mailing list, let us know. Thanks as always to Dara Young for editing, producing, adding captions, and posting these videos. And most importantly, if you have any questions about what I've said today or about any other emerging public health issue, please let me know. I look forward to hearing from you. Until next week, please be well.